Hello there. As part of my work with Flash Forward Briefing, I've been digging around the statistics about travel to and from work by rail with a view to seeing what might happen post-COVID in whatever version of new normal might then emerge. So what do we know? Well, according to the latest Transport Statistics Great Britain figures published by the Department for Transport just before Christmas, National Rail network in the autumn of 2019 accounted for around 6.7% of travel to and from work. That means that out of a workforce of 32.1 million people, just over 2.1 million used rail to travel to and from work every day in that autumn. We also know from the latest National Travel Survey data that commuting accounts for around 47% of rail demand. On the basis of the 2019 total passenger journey figure of 1,792 million journeys, this would imply a passenger journey figure of around 843 million a year. This correlates quite nicely with the TSGB figure of 2.1 million people because it implies 2 single journeys a day for 48 weeks a year on around 4.06 days a week. That seems a reasonable number. And the third thing we know about this is the socioeconomic composition of rail users. Analysing NTS work on transport use by socioeconomic classification suggests that 63% of English rail demand comes from the professional and managerial classes, with 13.2% from intermediate occupations and just 6.4% from routine and manual occupations. In trying to see what might happen post-COVID, there are two main risks concerning respectively the size of the workforce and the propensity to stay and work from home. On employment, the Office of Budget Responsibility suggested in November that under the scenario where vaccines become widely available in the spring, unemployment would peak at 5.1%. If that mass vaccination was delayed until the summer, then unemployment would rise a further to 7.5%. That, on the whole, seems a more reasonable assumption given the third lockdown and the damage that is doing clearly to the economy. That compares, by the way, with a rate of 3.7% in the autumn of 2019, so that it would imply a workforce emerging from the pandemic 4.3% smaller, i.e. around 30.7 million people. And here we have a table which shows the results of all those assumptions and predicts what an outturn might be. The first thing we do is make an assumption about the average journey length and the average revenue per passenger kilometre, and these are based on the actual figures for season ticket holders in 2019. The first line shows the outturn in 2019 based on the figures we've been talking about, a number of commuters of 2.16 million, producing 843 million trips a year and giving us 2.93 billion as an estimated figure for revenue. Then we see what would happen if those assumptions were maintained, but there was a 4.3% cut in the workforce, down to 2.07 million people. We see it takes the number of trips and the revenue down by 4.3% in that period. The third line looks at a position where all those journeys are made only on 3 days a week instead of the 4.06 days that we were talking about earlier. And you see that it takes demand for trips down to 595 million, which in historic terms is around 2010 levels, and it takes revenue down by a further 26%, or a total of 29% from the 2019 figure of to 2.07 billion. Then we look at a hybrid case, if you like, where existing intermediate and manual labour continues to work 5 days a week, as does 40% of the professional and managerial classes, with the other 60% switching to 3 days at the office and 2 at home. Under this scenario, we see that demand is not as low as if everybody was on 3 days a week, but it turns out at around 665 million journeys a year, with revenue of 2.3 billion, which is 21% down from 2019 levels. From the Treasury's point of view, my second subject, business travel, has more serious implications. NTS data shows that business travel accounts for around 9.8% of demand in 2019. However, the average journey length is much higher, and at around 90.5 kilometres, most of the people pay full fare and a lot pay first class fares, so that the yield per passenger kilometre is over 80% higher than that for season ticket holders. On this basis, I reckon business travel brings in around 3.6 billion a year for the industry, and therefore any fall will be disproportionately more damaging to the railway's economics. The signs aren't good. Looking at the NTS data for all modes, we see that technological change and other factors has depressed business travel volumes by around 58% since 2002. Now, the railways have been sheltered from that by modal shift. In fact, the railways' market share of business travel looks to have risen on this data from 3.5% to 7.5% over the period. However, if overall trip volumes continue to fall and rail's market share stabilises or even falls back a bit, then there is a serious problem. So those are some of the numbers that I've been looking at and the implications for the future of the rail industry. They're clearly not good, though they could very well be offset by the modal shift required in future to achieve the targets set by the latest climate change budget. But that's a subject for another day.